Welcome to the Gur in Fangirl podcast, a podcast where we discuss pop culture and fandom. Each episode, we talk with celebrities, fans, and creators about their work in the media that inspires them. Now here's your host, the creator of the Squee Project, filmmaker, fangirl, and feminist, Hansi Oppenheimer.
Today we're talking with writer Richard Chizmar. He's publisher of the highly regarded Cemetery Dance magazine and the owner of Cemetery Dance Publications. He's won Bram Stoker and World Fantasy Awards and published work from Stephen King, Clive Barker, Christopher Golden, Joe Lansdale, and Richard Lehman, among other well-respected authors. His most recent work is Gwendy's Magic Feather, the sequel to Gwendy's Button Box, which he co-wrote with Stephen King. We discuss his latest work, collaborating with Stephen King, and how he survived the early years publishing Cemetery Dance, with only occasional visits to what Richard calls Misery Hill. Anyway, here we go. Okay, so why don't we start with that? Why don't you tell me about your new book?
The new one coming out on November 19th is titled Gwendy's Magic Feather, and it's what it is it's a sequel to the novella that Stephen King and I wrote together back in 2017 called Gwendy's Button Box. But this time I'm going solo. I had originally come up with the idea back in January, and I just woke up with a really clear picture in my head of what Gwendy had been doing after the end of the first book. And I emailed Steve and I said, hey, what do you think about Gwendy as, and it was a short little 2-sentence email, and he wrote right back that morning and said, I think it's a great idea. I'm going to be busy for the foreseeable future with, and he, mentioned the name of the book, which I forget now. And he said, but you should write it. So in my wisdom, in my excitement and wisdom, I took that as, go ahead, Rich, you write the first draft. Since we collaborated on the first one, I'll write the second draft, and then we'll do what we did before and play ping pong back and forth. And I'm actually glad that I was naive and thought that, because otherwise I probably never would have put pen to paper and started, because I wouldn't have had, however you want to term that, I wouldn't have had the courage or the guts to go solo into Castle Rock, Maine by myself.
Yeah, that's understandable. Yeah, I get that.
So,
yeah.
So it was a happy accident, yeah. I mean, it wasn't until I finished the first draft and sent it to Steve that I learned, no, I was all on my own, which was a shock and terrifying, but yeah, that's how it happened.
Yeah, I think the whole thing's really interesting, and I haven't spoken to Stephen King. I've spoken to Joe Hill for the Joe Lansdale documentary.
Right.
But God knows I've been reading Stephen King forever.
All of us, yeah.
As long as I can remember, I've been reading Stephen King, and so his voice is very, I can draw it up in my head fairly easily, and just him as a presence too, from all the film appearances and things I've seen of him. Even what was it, his band with the other?
Oh yeah, Rock Bottom Remainders. Yeah,
yeah.
He has not led the typical sheltered writer's life, for sure.
Well, yes and no. I mean, Mick Garris and I discussed that about. In fact, he even mentions that. Mick Garris mentions that in my doc. We talk about how both Joe and Stephen, have sort of stayed, either in Bangor or Nacogdoches. They haven't, moved to Beverly Hills and sort of kept their voices sort of consistent with who they are by staying, in these sort of out-of-the-way places.
Right. Yeah, no, I mean, I do think in that regard, but not as far as exposure. I mean, Steve's, as you know, I mean, hell, he had an American Express commercial all those years ago. So, yeah, whether it's through his work, yeah, I think it's whether it's, obviously predominantly through his work and his voice and in his stories and his books. We all feel like we, I think that's one of the big keys to his success is, we all feel like we know him, I think that's how he got the Uncle Steve, moniker is that he feels like the guy who, comes over on the holidays and you sit out on the porch with him and he tells you stories while he smokes a pipe or a cigarette. But yeah, he's just been that that unusual case where he's had commercials and cameos in movies and, interviews instead of with the local paper. He's on Good Morning America, that kind of thing. So, yeah,
I don't think he lives that kind of rock star. I mean, I don't think he lives that life because I've actually, of course, I've done the pilgrimage to the house in Bangor, and except for the crazy fence, I mean, it's just a nice Victorian house in Bangor. It's not, palazzo. It's,
Right. Well, if you ever look at an air shot of it, it is the sprawling house that goes on forever.
Okay.
But yeah, no,
right.
I know, I've been fortunate that I've had a business relationship with Steve grow over the years into a friendship. And yeah, no, I mean, that's one of the coolest things about him. People ask me all the time, what's he really like? And, I'm very protective of that friendship with Steve and
of course.
Observations of his life. But I always say that's one of the neatest things about him is he, I've been invited to parties celebrating his work at Tavern on the Green in New York, and says right on the invitation, jeans are fine. He is down to earth. He has picked me up to take me to ball games before, down in Florida, because he lives in, he and Tabby live in Florida during the winters.
Right.
And he's picked me up to take me to spring training baseball games, and same is, it's just always the same Steve. Blue jeans and a t-shirt, and great sense of humor, very kind and generous, and he. The houses may have gotten bigger, but he's still the same guy at heart.
Well, what I love too is I think it's so important, especially now when we're finding out so many terrible things about so many creators and are having to parse out this person was a wonderful creator, but they're an awful human being. That there are creators who are actually really decent human beings and great creators. And we should be supporting them even more because, right? I mean, they should get brownie points for also being good people.
That's one of the things I love about Steve is he just, he doesn't have that filter that you see with a lot of people. He just, he put it out there about his problems in the past, whether it be drug addiction or alcoholism, and how his family and Tabby in particular was instrumental in getting him past that and pushing him to become a better, healthier person. And, that's and he doesn't hide his political leanings. He's passionate. He just kind of puts it out there and you take him or you leave him. And again, that's one of the cool things about him is he's very genuine. And that's always a word that I use when describing Steve is, if you're fortunate enough to hang out with him and speak with him or text with him or whatever, you don't have a lot of questions about how he feels about certain things. He's very honest with you.
But even
and I like that.
I think is that he, supported, you taking over a project that he sort of felt that he no longer could or wanted to, was very encouraging. I think that's really important.
Yeah, I mean, he's one of the most encouraging, supportive writers out there, whether it's blurbs or, just tweeting about books. I can't even tell you how many times, yourself is that he's tweeted about a book and then boom, all of a sudden, it sells copies. And it's, it's not only, newer writers or mid-list writers who say this about him. I just read something the other day about, who was it? I think Linwin Barclay, who, is a bestseller, talking about how supportive he is. And the guy who wrote The Cartel, and of course I'm blanking on his name right now, fantastic writer, saying the same thing. He's like, I don't know any other writer who's as supportive and as generous as Stephen King. And as far as Gwendy, that was another happy accident. I've told that story a few times, but we were literally just emailing about collaborations, and in particular, those round robin projects where you have 5, 6, 10, 12 writers and they each write like a section. And in this email exchange, he mentioned that he had a story that he started and couldn't finish. And I just said, because, I'm fortunate that sometimes I get to read books in advance or short. So he might send me a file of a short story and say, hey, this is going to be published this fall in blank. Thought you might like to read it. So it's kind of cool. I get some sneak peeks. And so I didn't hesitate. I said, oh, well, I'd love to read it if you want to send it. And the next day, he sent me, the incomplete Gwendy's button box and very short little brief note with the email that said, "Do with it what you want." And I'm thinking, what does that mean? So I wrote him back, and I read it. I sat there and I read it in this parking lot because I was out on the road, and just loved it. I loved the character, loved the setting. And I wrote him back and I said, do you want me to take a crack at finishing it? And he's like, "Yeah, if you feel like you can." And I was like, "Oh, okay." So, yeah, I was terrified for the weekend because I remember that was a Friday. And, I was terrified the entire weekend, didn't tell a soul. And then Monday I sat down to write, and I actually sat down to write some notes about it, some thoughts on where I might take it, and my hand was shaking because I was writing longhand. I thought, all right, Rich, this is ridiculous. So I just opened my laptop and started writing instead. And that was the really neat thing about it. Is about an hour into it, it's just everything went away. I was in Castle Rock with teenage Gwendy Peterson, and kind of forgot that I was actually, collaborating with Stephen King, who is, I wouldn't be doing any of this without Steve. There'd be no Cemetery Dance publications or any of that because he really was the guiding force that got me to this field. So
Cemetery Dance is amazing. I mean, can you talk a little bit how that happened? Because that's been one of my favorite, publishers and publications for since the 80s, right?
Yeah, 1988. I was in college at the University of Maryland, and I was writing my own short stories of horror and suspense and crime and submitting them to magazines. And I was pretty fortunate. I mean, I got, tons of rejections just like every new writer does. But I was pretty fortunate that I was starting to sell some. And, they would show up in the mail, my contributor copies, and I'd be so excited. And then I would open the envelope and I'd look at some of the contributor copies and I'd just be like, okay, this is one I'm not going to show my parents because, the cover might have been this hideously poorly drawn, monster or something, and it was like, oh, okay, I can't show this to anybody because they're going to think I'm nuts. Not because of the monster, but just because of how poorly executed everything was. And I don't mean that in a harsh way, because trust me, I learned firsthand soon enough how difficult publishing a magazine was. But I just, what was interesting is I was excited to be selling my stories, excited to be learning so much and having some, limited success. But very few of the magazines I was selling to, and there were exceptions, were what I kind of envisioned small press horror magazines should have been. And at some point, I've always been, kind of a self-starter. And at some point, I remember thinking, I could do this. There was nothing really to kind of push me over that hump until I found an issue of the Horror Show magazine edited by David Silva. And this was, had a glossy cover. It wasn't real fancy inside. It was newsprint page, paper stock, a pretty simple design. But the content was amazing. He had new writers right next to, people like Dean Koontz. And Joe Lansdale was a semi-new writer back then. But he was just becoming very successful. And he had a mixture of fiction and reviews and interviews. It was everything that I thought a magazine should be. And then I found out that David published it by himself. That he was a one-man crew up there in the mountains of Northern California. And that was the impetus to start CD. I just thought, well, if Dave can do it, maybe I can do it. And I was fortunate in that he was very helpful. He answered a lot of questions back in those days of snail mail and mailing out letters and exchanging them and getting them back and forth. That was kind of neat in the beginning. But yeah, I just started a magazine when I was a senior in college, put out the first 2 issues while I was still in college. And then I just stuck with it. It was slow, steady growth. But as soon as I did it, I knew that that's what I was supposed to be doing, and along with writing. And so I never went back. I graduated, got a degree in journalism, never did a resume, never went out and got a real job. I just lived poor for 10 years until, it became a viable, profitable business. And year 3, we started publishing books, and it's kind of how it happened.
I know it's 10 years of, incredibly hard work, and I'm sure there were a lot of sleepless nights where you're like, how am I going to pay my bills? But
oh my God, all the time. So many stories like that most people don't want to hear, but I tell them, I just, when they, nowadays with, the internet and the media gratification and such sophisticated design, software and all of that, I tell people, it's a long process, and, there are plenty of times I was counting change out of the car, and, I had the apartment complex that my wife and I lived at had this big hill out front, and she knew if she pulled in the driveway from, because she's a few years younger than me and she was going to physical therapy school. She knew if she pulled in and saw me sitting up on that hill that the day had not gone good. We always nicknamed it Misery Hill because that's where I went out to wait. But yeah, I mean, a lot of ups and downs and a lot of, learning from your mistakes, but also a lot of, really great, just, I look back and I'm so fortunate that, number one, I was young. I didn't have any responsibilities as far as children or a real job or anything. I could kind of take that chance. I always joked that I financed the business on 25% interest because, I didn't have a big bankroll of money or anything like that, to say the least. So, when you just graduate from college, that's when all those evil credit card companies send you their credit cards.
Yeah.
And, I didn't rack up bills partying or going to Mexico or some island. I just put it all into the magazine, and I was very fortunate that eventually I was able to pay them off and it became a profitable business. But yeah, I was always aware of the fact that it could go either way and was just very stubborn. And I loved what I did. So those 80, 90 hour work weeks, just, they didn't feel so bad, except on those certain days when I found myself out on Misery Hill.
Well, I mean, I'm doing the same thing with documentaries, and it's just starting to pay off. I've been doing it for 20 years now. And
right.
It took me that long to kind of figure out how to do it and how not to get completely fucked over on contracts.
Right, yeah.
And I'm just starting to learn, how to, create a business plan, and I just made it an LLC. But, for years it was just I'd start working on a film, and then I'd try to find someone else to distribute it, and a lot of times that worked out really terribly for me. And then, I'd say, I'm never doing this again. And then a year later, I'd be like, well, this is a really interesting idea, because I think if you're an artist, you can't stop. You might want to stop, but you can't.
We don't have a choice. Yeah, we don't have a choice. I honestly do believe that to a very large extent, it's just how we're built, and it's gonna rear its head at times when we don't want it to. But yeah, I mean, I'm glad it's becoming successful and a little easier, because that's the big thing is that, I always said it, look, if I was just trying to make a buck, I could be doing any number of different things.
Oh, hell yeah, a lot easier.
Yeah.
A lot less hours.
Oh, my gosh.
A lot more sleep.
Yes.
Absolutely.
There's so many easier roads, but I think that's why it becomes so satisfying, and the gratitude is so monumental when it kind of finally does click over and become a little easier. And, then you have new challenges always ahead of you, but they're different challenges. And when you've looked for that spare change in your car enough, or you've gotten, $60 in cash from an overseas customer for whatever, and you're actually staring at $60 in cash in your hand as a big deal, you're ready for those newer, easier challenges than those days.
Do you think that's particular to the writer community, that writers tend, or is it just specifically to these, like King and Lansdale and a few other people, that they're more out there to help and support other creators?
I think it's one of the really nice things about the writing community, but especially like the horror genre. I think you have a lot of people who go out of their way to help and give back. Because they were helped. You look at someone like Brian Keene, who's very well known for helping newer writers and struggling writers, and it's because Richard Lehman helped him and other people helped him. And I'm the same way in the publishing side of things. I have my Facebook and Twitter messages are often full of questions from people who are wanting to edit and publish an anthology or a magazine or an online newsletter, that type of thing. And more so in the old days than now, because there's just not as many people out there publishing. But, I'm always, I won't ignore them. I'll always give some answers because, and as much time as I can, because without David Silva and other people like that helping me, I never would have made it, despite good intentions and a hard head. And a lot of patience. The advice that I got from others was invaluable. So I do think we're lucky in that regard.
It's funny that it's like of all the genre communities, that the horror community is like the most empathetic and compassionate and helpful. I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, you know what? The people have said that for a while, and I just think it's, I think we are people with empathy and an understanding of good and bad and the dark side and the light side, and I think that's why a lot of horror fiction, kind of exhibits both ends of that spectrum as far as good and evil, and so I think there are a lot of people who, are inspired and intrigued by the dark stuff, but at heart they're pretty happy people and pretty kind people. Yeah,
very generous. I've been really enjoying working with them. Do you have any thoughts on so since Cemetery Dance started in late 80s, was that sort of part of Splatterpunk, or did you come in a little later?
You know what? No, I was there because that's when. It was a little bit, I started reading earlier in the year in 88, and I'm pretty sure that's when the Splatterpunk was all over, like Twilight Zone, and then those infamous pictures of Dave Scow and Joe and McCammon and Skip Inspector and R.C. Matheson and Garton, they were all there, and that's back when, Ziesing and Dark Harvest were publishing a lot of books that were, in that Splatterpunk category. And I do know, because people would always, is CD going to become Splatterpunk? And I'm like, well, CD is kind of just the kind of place where you can find a really graphic story right next to a straight crime story. I never kind of allowed us to get pigeonholed in that way. But I was there through a lot of the, the Splatterpunk versus quiet horror controversies, that kind of thing. Iniquities, which was
what was it? Bizarro horror? Wasn't that another that sort of was an outgrowth?
Yeah, that was much more recent.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I think Bizarro has come about much more, recently than, in more so in the new century. If it was back in the 1990s, I wasn't really that aware of it. But when did Splatterpunk kind of slow down and kind of phase out? I don't know.
Well, I mean, they had a panel. They had a panel at KillerCon talking about that, and this is actually how I got involved in this whole documentary, because they were talking about it, and they were talking about how it sort of fell apart in the 90s because the publishers decided to, and I'm sure you know more about this than I do, but that the publishers decided to invest more in like a Stephen King or a Dean Koontz or a John Saul rather than all these different, writers. And so a lot of the, newer writers or lesser known writers had harder time getting their stuff out there.
Well, yeah, and I don't think that was just big publishing. That was just, I don't even think that was so much genre as it was, when somewhere in the 90s publishing kind of imploded. It went downhill, and the mid-list disappeared. And that's what they're talking about. The mid-list writers, they kind of got swept away. And that's what really actually gave a strong kick to the specialty press, because those folks had to get published somewhere. But the mid-list disappeared, and they started putting all the money into the big writers. And it wasn't like it had been, in the 80s and the early 90s, the heyday of publishing, when they were trying to grow writers, and they had horror imprints that released 2 or 4 books every single month from the same imprint. So it was just really thriving and prevalent. But then, like with anything else, it got overloaded and glutted, and I'm sure the economy tanked, and overall, and that led to that. But I think even before that, there was, like, when Del Abyss, they created the Del Abyss line, which was like more literary, kind of strange horror, and it was never really to my cup of tea, even though they published several writers I really like. But I think that's when publishing kind of consciously tried to go away from the Splatterpunk. And then I think when the mid-list disappeared was kind of the final nail in the coffin. But, it was an exciting time. And I remember just feeling like the whole Splatterpunk versus quiet horror was just silly. There was plenty of room for so many different kind of subsets of horror and what you liked, whether it was Charlie Grant's quiet kind of, more creeping dread horror, or whether it was Stephen King's Americana, small town type horror, or whether it was, Skip Inspector writing about rock music or vampires in the subways. It was all there, It was an exciting time.
Yeah, and I think, Splatterpunk is such a weird thing too, because a lot of the people that sort of were, designated as Splatterpunk, really weren't. Really, Skip Inspector might be the only ones I would consider to be really Splatterpunk. Lansdale.
They were for sure, obviously.
Lansdale did a couple of stories or books that way, but then in general, he's not. He's genre fluid. You can't really, and Clive Barker, I think, is something different too. I don't think he's Splatterpunk. Who would you say is a good example besides Skip Inspector of Splatterpunk?
I think Skip Inspector, pretty much across the board. I think a few of Ray Garton's early titles, just because he wrote some really graphic stuff. I think some, a decent percentage of David Scow. But some of the others they put, and I think Joe too. Joe, to a certain extent, was, I know he never liked the, being called that because he didn't want to get.
I don't think any of them liked it.
I think some of those young guys. I think some of those young guys probably did like it because, I find it hard to believe that Skip Inspector didn't like it, but yeah, I think that's it. McCammon was definitely not a Splatterpunk. Joe, a lot of Joe's work had, and it's something that attracted me to his work immediately. Is it, some of Joe's work was really graphic and bloody and gory, but a lot of it was really tender and quiet. And a lot of it was just wonky and goofy. So you kind of had a little bit of everything with Joe. So I understand why he didn't want to be, put in a box. And like I said, McCammon, with the exception of maybe one or two short stories, out of all of his output, he was never anything close to a Splatterpunk. So
how would you define Splatterpunk?
You know what?
Sorry.
That's that age-old question that people have been asking even back then. And to me, it was just about, pushing boundaries in a way. It was about provoking and pushing boundaries in a very loud way. And that often was through excessive violence and blood and gore. But, the folks who were doing it and doing it well, like Skip Inspector and Scow, it wasn't, it always it always kind of transcended just being, there wasn't blood and gore and violence just for the sake of that. It was always integral to the story, and it always made the story work in a better way than it would have worked without it. And I think, to me, that's just what Splatterpunk was about, provoking and kind of pushing those boundaries that had been, put in place by what was being published at the time. It was just like some people waking up to a different type of movie or a different type of, story in any genre, whether it's, found footage films all of a sudden came about. That was a movement, and
right.
Along with a handful of really good stuff, there was the glut of bad stuff, and that Splatterpunk was no exception.
Well, and also, I grew up in the New York punk scene. I was 17 in 77, so I lived at CBGBs and Max's and that whole scene. And, what was termed punk, there were so many, the Dictators and Blondie and the Ramones and Television and Suicide. None of those sounded the same. There was,
right.
a huge swath of what was considered punk, Blondie was really pop, and, Television, experimental almost, or, Suicide was noise.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, so I think movements are really hard, and as David Scow had explained to me when I asked him about that, and about coining the term, he's pretty much once you name it, it's over.
Right, yeah. No, I agree with that. Yeah, once you name it or it becomes too popular, then it's done. And Richard Lehman, he's someone who I forgot. I don't think he was always, he was in that Splatterpunk picture, and certainly a large percentage of his short stories, were gory and over the top. But I still contend Lehman was kind of like his own genre unto himself, because there was just kind of nobody doing what he was doing.
What about someone like Jack Ketchum?
I was just going to say that because Lehman and Ketchum kind of go hand in hand with me.
Right.
You know what? It's just interesting. Dallas always, to me, Dallas kind of always knew exactly what he was doing. And again, he was someone who pushed boundaries, absolutely, but on purpose, and sometimes in a more literary way than some of these other guys did. And I think, Lehman, you always had and largely the same goes for Lansdale and Skip Inspector. You always had the sense that they were having so much fun doing it. With Dallas, I just felt like even in some of those early
when you
books,
say
like
Dallas, are you talking about Jack Ketchum? Or?
Yeah.
Oh,
yeah.
I didn't know that was a nickname for him, or.
Yeah, Jack Ketchum is his pseudonym, and Dallas Mayer is his real name.
Oh, I had no idea.
Yeah,
okay.
yeah. And so I always feel weird calling him Jack, because I'm like, no, I always knew him as Dallas. He signed his letters Dallas, and but he just always. Those guys just seemed like they were having fun and kind of cackling behind their keyboards half the time they were writing stuff. And I mean, I know that to be true of Lehman and Joe and them. Even though, obviously the business of writing was dead serious to those guys. But just some of the stories where they pushed those boundaries, I had the feeling that they were having such a good time. Dallas, on the other hand, I just feel like it was life and death writing to him. And there was a lot of his serious side put into even the stories like Off Season, where there were, cannibals living in caves. There was just, whether he was making a statement about, women at the time and their role in society or whatever. He just always had a lot going on. And that's kind of always been my take on Ketchum, is that it was always coming from kind of a deeper, more literary place than some of the others.
Red is like one of my favorite books of his.
Yeah, that's
unrelenting.
And the furthest thing from Splatterpunk you can find, pretty much,
Yeah. But I guess
it's just a thriller.
Yeah, but I guess it's terms are tricky.
Yeah.
Yeah. So when is your book coming out? Where can people find it?
Like I said, it's coming out November 19th. Gwendy's Magic Feather. It'll pretty much be everywhere. I mean, the pre-orders have been great. Barnes & Noble, Books A Million.
I saw it's on Amazon as well for pre-order.
Oh yeah. It's been on Amazon for a while now, and I mean, the first book, Gwendy's Magic Feather, with Gwendy's Button Box with Steve, was actually like a New York Times and Publishers Weekly, Wall Street Journal bestseller, all those things. So
I love how you just throw that in, like that's like just like, there was a New York Times bestseller.
Yeah. I mean, well, I had no idea either. I just, like I said, we just kind of just put it out there. The orders came pouring in, and we still didn't really think about that until week one. And I remember I bought a copy of USA Today, and I don't even remember why. Or actually, I didn't. I picked it up, and there was a reason why. I don't remember whether it was because I was looking for, a sports result or something. But I picked up a USA Today at a 7-Eleven and looked at it. And before I could open up to the inside, right on the bottom of the front page, it had the top 5 selling books in the country for the week. And then you turn inside and it had like the top 50. But right on the front at number 5 was Gwendy's Button Box. And my mouth dropped open. I was like, what?
Oh my God.
Yeah, that was cool. So then, I think it stayed on the bestseller list for 3 or 4 weeks. And it was just very exciting. And obviously that's because Stephen King's name was on there and it came first. So we expected a huge drop, obviously, on this one with Steve did an introduction for it, a forward to the book. Everyone out there, through marketing, everyone knows it's a sequel to the book that I did with Steve, and still got Steve's name on the cover thanks to the forward. He's very, very kind to do that. So it's got a lot going for it, but we still expected the pre-order numbers to drop tremendously. But so far, they've held up. The first printing is going to be the exact same as it was with Button Box, and hopefully we don't get killed with returns, and it does well. And I'm not even really thinking about the bestseller list or anything like that. I just want to get it out there and hope people like it. You know, the reviews.
Right. You can't write for the accolades. You have to write because you love the work, and then if the accolades come, awesome. But yeah. Otherwise,
I would have quit a long time ago if it was for the accolades.
Exactly.
And I've actually learned, I've actually learned that those accolades kind of don't amount to a whole lot as far as the awards and all that stuff. People always say, well, what would it mean if you won this or you got a lifetime? And I say, well, I want to be respectful and be polite, but I also have to tell you, all it would mean is, maybe 15 minutes of me kind of reminiscing and being grateful for those people for recognizing something. But then it's just, it's a couple extra words in your bio, because I've never, I've won World Fantasy Awards and World Horror Awards and these and that. And that, it really was what it is it just, it adds some legitimacy to your bio. But I've always kind of been of the opinion that, those awards, I've probably won awards in years I didn't deserve them, and probably years where maybe a book I edited or something, was nominated and didn't win. And I think, well, Best of Cemetery Dance won, collected, 50 stories that spanned over like a 15-year period. And that was, those were some really good stories by people like Joe and Ketchum and Lehman and Lansdale and King and all the rest of them. And, a book like that, if it was going to ever win an award, it'd be a book like that. So I kind of just say, hey, it's all subjective. Who knows? I've never gone to a convention and accept awards. So I've always kind of just gone on to the next thing. And so, yeah, it's definitely never been why I do it and never will be. I just,
no, but I just think the awards are nice, but I think what really is your legacy, aside from your own work, is also, Cemetery Dance and publishing, all these other writers and supporting them, both new and, ones who, are established. I think that's quite a legacy to be proud of.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I appreciate it. And there's been times, not in the past, because like I said, it was just always what we did. But it's, now we publish so many books, and the magazine is such a small part of that. We, there's been times when the accountant and the business side of things have come up and said, you should probably just stop doing that and put that money and time and energy into the book line, which is much more profitable. And then I've had people like Stephen King and some others say, Rich, for 3 decades now, you've published not only the big guys, but you've had these newer writers who have, you've given them that first published story or that second story and the thrill of opening the envelope and pulling out the contributor copies. And they're like, are you really ready to give that up? And I always come back to the same thing. No, not yet.
Thanks for joining us this week on the Grr in Fangirl. If you enjoyed our show, be sure to visit our website, www.squeeprojects.com, where you can subscribe to the podcast and our YouTube channel for lots more squee as fuck pop culture content.